The State Department has announced that North Korean forces have launched an invasion across the 38th parallel into the territory of the Republic of Korea. What if you fought a war, and the world forgot you? Not because the battles weren't brutal, or the sacrifices weren't profound, but because your story was trapped between two giants, the glorious victory of World War II and the televised turmoil of Vietnam. This is not a hypothetical question. This is the reality for the veterans of Korea. A conflict that claimed millions of lives, redefined global politics, and then faded into the background of history. Tonight we remember. If you're ready to uncover the full, unvarnished truth of history's most overlooked chapters, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel and join our community. As we begin this journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Your location connects this global story to a global audience. The year is 1950. The euphoria of 1945 has evaporated, replaced by a new, chilling tension, the Cold War. The world is now split along an ideological fault line. In this new struggle, Korea, a country liberated from Japanese rule, becomes an unintended casualty. At the war's end, it was hastily divided along the 38th parallel, a line drawn by junior American officers on a map, with no thought for the people who lived there. The North fell under Soviet communism, the South under American influence. Two hostile governments, each claiming to be the legitimate ruler of all Korea, now faced each other across an arbitrary border. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came at dawn on June 25, 1950. Over 100,000 well-trained, Soviet-equipped North Korean troops poured across the border. Their T-34 tanks, veterans of the Eastern Front, were far superior to anything the South possessed. The invasion was a tidal wave of steel and fire. The South Korean army, poorly armed and unprepared, was shattered. Cities fell in days. Panic set in. Civilians fled south by the millions, creating rivers of human desperation on the roads. The world watched in horror as the communist advance squeezed the remaining South Korean and initial American forces into a tiny defensive perimeter around the southern port city of Pusan. This was the Pusan perimeter, the last foothold of a nation on the brink of annihilation. Enter General Douglas MacArthur, the brilliant, egotistical proconsul of Japan. While his forces were besieged at Pusan, he saw an opportunity not for rescue, but for reversal. He proposed a plan so audacious his own staff called it impossible. He would land an amphibious force not at a friendly beach, but 150 miles behind enemy lines, at the port of Incheon. The challenges were staggering. Incheon had some of the world's most extreme tides, a 30-foot difference between high and low tide, leaving a vast plain of mud for most of the day. The landing window was a matter of hours. The channel was narrow and easily defended. But MacArthur was a gambler. On September 15, 1950, under heavy fire, the U.S. Marines hit the seawalls. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight, but it worked. The Incheon landing was a tactical masterpiece. It severed the North Korean supply lines and sent their army into a disorganized rout. The forces at Pusan broke out. Within weeks, the UN forces had not only liberated South Korea, they were racing north, toward the Yalu River, the border with China. The goal was no longer containment, it was unification. But victory bred overconfidence. As UN forces advanced deep into North Korea, the warnings began to arrive. China would not tolerate foreign troops on its border. MacArthur dismissed them. He promised the boys would be home by Christmas. But in the frozen mountains of North Korea, a ghost army was watching. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteers had secretly crossed the Yalu. In late November 1950, they struck. They attacked at night, using bugles and whistles to create confusion, swarming UN positions in human waves. The Americans and their allies, stretched thin and unprepared for the Siberian cold, were overwhelmed. This was not a retreat, it was a rout. It became the longest fallback in American military history. At the chosen reservoir, the 1st Marine Division was surrounded by 10 Chinese divisions. In temperatures of -35 degrees Fahrenheit, -37 degrees Celsius, they fought their way out, inflicting crippling casualties on the Chinese in what became known as the attack in a different direction. It was an epic feat of arms, but it was still a retreat. The triumphant advance had collapsed into a fight for survival. For the next 2.5 years, the war descended into a brutal, World War I-style stalemate. A front line solidified across the waist of the peninsula, not far from the original 38th parallel. And here, men died for hills. Not strategic cities or ports, but worthless pieces of terrain with names that would become etched in blood: Pork Chop Hill, Old Baldy, Heartbreak Ridge. This was a soldier's war of endless patrols, artillery duels, and trench raids. They battled not just a determined enemy, but also the elements: sweltering summers filled with flies and disease, and winters so cold that skin would stick to rifle metal. They fought in mud and filth, plagued by a sense of futility. What was the strategic value of a hilltop, only to abandon it weeks later? The war became a grinding, bloody negotiation. Finally, on July 27, 1953, after 2 years of tortuous negotiations, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom. The guns fell silent. But it was a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. The border was established almost exactly where the war had begun. A demilitarized zone, DMZ, was created, a 2.5-mile wide scar across the peninsula, littered with landmines and guarded by thousands of troops. The cost was staggering. Over 36,000 Americans dead. More than 100,000 wounded. But that pales in comparison to the Korean cost: an estimated 2 to 3 million civilians and soldiers dead, missing, or wounded. The peninsula was devastated. When the American soldiers returned home, there were no ticker-tape parades. The nation, already looking toward a new decade and a new kind of war in Southeast Asia, barely noticed. They came home to silence. They called it the Forgotten War. But its legacy is anything but. It was the first major test of the UN and the Cold War policy of containment. It set a precedent: communism would be challenged by force, but within limits, avoiding a direct world war. It transformed the US into a permanent global military power. And most profoundly, the war never ended. The armistice holds, but the DMZ remains the most heavily fortified border on Earth. The silence of the veterans was echoed by the frozen silence of the truce. A conflict that began with a thunderous invasion simply stopped, leaving a nation forever divided. This is the story they never taught you in full. The story of courage, miscalculation, and sacrifice that shaped our modern world. If you believe these forgotten stories deserve a voice, then be part of our mission. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and help us bring these shadows of history into the light. We have many more stories to tell. And once again, we'd love to know, where in the world are you joining us from? Let us know in the comments.